Thank you.
Okay, do you want to set up your
Yeah.
screen share?
Yeah.
Okay, go to the green thing.
Right. I'm getting my instructions here. And then,
And
Hello, Steve.
hello.
that's
Good
Jane.
to see you.
Jane is behind this. Wait a minute.
Yeah, I'm looking for the
Slideshow.
hit that. Click there.
This?
Yes, click that.
Okay.
Okay, close the mail. Close
yeah.
this mail. Wait. Okay, close
Yeah.
close that. Close that. And okay, now go back to the Zoom meeting
Okay, good.
and
That's it.
you have your thing there. Click that
Okay.
and then share.
Got it.
And now start your slideshow.
It's hardly.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay, we'll just pause
There
for
we
a
go.
moment, Judith.
great.
We'll do the introductions.
Sorry about that, folks. Okay.
All right,
And
so we'll do
close that
the,
window.
Okay.
you can leave that up, but we'll do the introductions. Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending. I'm Marielle O'Neill, and I'd just like to introduce our panelists. Judith Allen leads the Virginia Woolf Reading Group at Kelly Writers House at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of Virginia Woolf and the Politics of Language and Virginia Woolf Walking in the Footsteps of Michael de Montaigne, and articles and chapters on the works of Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and Michael de Montaigne. Probably pronouncing that wrong. She's co-editing with Jane Goldman and Bryony Randall the new Cambridge edition of The Room with One's Own. Our second panelist is Giulia Laddago. Giulia is a PhD candidate at the University of Bari, Italy. She holds a master's degree in modern languages and literatures and studies photography at the Italian Institute of Photography in Milan. Her research focuses on the relationship between literature and photography, including issues of intermediality and phototextuality. In particular, her dissertation aims to investigate the influence of visual cultures and photography on Virginia Woolf's writing. Her interests include modernism, stylistics, gender studies, post-colonial studies, and spoken word poetry. So we thought we would do the presentations, then have a 5-minute break, then do the questions and the answers. So Judith, if you'd like to start. Thank you.
Great, yes. My title needs a little bit of explanation, so I'm going to begin with that. Breaking news is quite a familiar term to most of us who have watched the mainstream media, and we now think of it as a meaningless term, not to be taken seriously. But we usually have yesterday's tragedy on our minds as we reach for our phones, turn on our computers, our TVs, and with a certain degree of anxiety, go to our chosen sites, the ones we trust to provide us with, quote, reliable information. We live with a certain dread of what will confront us tomorrow, for we feel somewhat bombarded with all of the recent news. As Paul Sonnemour points out in his aptly titled book, Tense Future, modern world's apparent totality lay not just in the extent of its willingness to injure bodies and objects. It also targeted civilian workers' morale and psychic well-being through propaganda and inflicts psychic damage long before a single bomb is dropped through what he calls, quote, weaponizing anticipation. We are experiencing that anticipation, and our imagination is not at all helpful. That manufacturing consent is alive and well is not surprising, for this term is back in the news today, although that may depend on which media site you frequently use. It comes from Walter Lippmann's Public Opinion, published in 1922, and is part of Leonard and Virginia Woolf's library. Supposedly, quote, it was given a bland title because its contents are so explosive, unquote, and that is from the foreword by Ronald Steele. A wartime propagandist and reporter, Lippmann saw, quote, the power of public opinion as greater than that of the legislative branch of government, unquote. So accuracy of news reporting was crucial for him. Manipulating public opinion for him was an easy task. And sounding like Virginia Woolf on the subject of facts in so many of her texts, Lippmann states that, quote, what we assume to be facts may only be judgments. Facts, in other words, are subject to interpretation, unquote. One can clearly see Lippmann's impact on Woolf's Three Guineas and Craftsmanship. As Woolf's narrator states in Three Guineas, quote, there are clearly different versions of the same fact, unquote. Lippmann's skepticism, like Woolf's, relates to the problems inherent in language and subsequent difficulties of communication. For Lippmann, quote, words like currency are turned over and over again to evoke one set of images today, another tomorrow. There is no certainty whatever that the same word will call out exactly the same idea in the reader's mind as it did in the reporter's. Questions abound. Who controls the increasingly varied sources of our information? And how and when will we know if it's all disinformation, misinformation, or simply very general propaganda? What has been censored, partially withheld, transformed by changing a single word? In the United States, one thinks of the Orwellian transformation of torture, changed to, quote, enhanced interrogation techniques. For those in control did not want to deal with the illegality of torture, although we were definitely doing it. The word torture was not allowed to be used on many TV stations and newspapers. PBS and the New York Times are included until 2009, which sounds kind of shocking. Like torture, the word genocide also has certain legal meanings which prevent the United States from using it, even though it's perfectly applicable in many cases. According to David Bromwich, in his excellent article on euphemism and American violence in the New York Review of Books in 2008, the formation of NPR Czech, that's National Public Radio, but that includes the television, was a response to what many in the media considered the euphemizing of torture. And we've euphemized a lot of things and a lot of words. And Orwell does a great job on that. In today's media world, including Twitter, YouTube, Substack, The Gray Zone, Counterpunch, The Black Agenda Report, Chris Hedges, Katie Halper, and many others, to name some of the alternative independent sites that compete with the mainstream media. This includes material of all political stripes. There has been the freedom on these sites to speak, to write, to show videos, but this has recently been changing. Many of these sites have been, and the word they use is deplatformed, and cite the algorithms that show low readership, low viewership, although the sites seem to be mostly left-leaning sites. They have been quite courageous and find that both thinking against the current and speaking against the current, from Woolf's Thoughts on Peace in an Air Raid, is becoming problematic today, for they have failed to repeat the official story, what the corporate world and the government want communicated. The need to censor or self-censor to maintain one's job is reminiscent of Leo Tolstoy's commentary about government and a statement that Woolf wrote in a letter that I will quote. Both are echoed in Three Guineas. Tolstoy finds that, quote, governments fear expression of independent thought more than an army. And I think we can actually relate that to the United States today. Newspapers for both Tolstoy and Woolf were not to be trusted and became for Woolf the damn newspapers, from a letter, an early letter of her day. And more explicitly, quote, are prostituted fact purveyors from Three Guineas. Tolstoy, in his essay, Government and Patriotism, which Woolf had read, belittles the lying patriotic press. In Woolf's critique of those prostituted fact purveyors, her narrator states that, quote, if you want to know any fact about politics, you must read at least 3 newspapers, compare the 3 versions of the same fact, and come in the end to your own conclusion. In other words, you have to strip each statement of its money motive its power motive, its advertisement motive, its publicity motive, before you make up your mind about which fact of politics to believe. Both Woolf and Tolstoy understood the financial aspects of this news business. Each paper is financed by a board, that each board has a policy, that each board employs writers to expound that policy. And if writers do not agree with that policy, the writers, as you remember, find themselves unemployed in the street. Also 3 guineas. One cannot talk about the relationship between journalism and ethics during Woolf's lifetime or our current situation today without alluding to the concept of manufacturing consent, a concept we must battle every time we receive information. Although most frequently associated with the book Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman, this term was first used by Walter Lippmann's 1922 landmark study, Public Opinion, and appropriated by Chomsky and Herman to expose how this propaganda model functions. Filled with explanatory charts, they reveal what stories get covered, which were totally ignored. It's an amazing book, tremendous material, revised in 2002, but it could be revised again. And there's also a film about this book. Going beyond a critique of press accuracy, Lippmann asks, quote, how can the public get the information it needed to make rational political judgments if it could not rely on the press? Virginia Woolf, dealing with the propaganda promulgated during World War I and Britain's problematic media empire, the Northcliffe Press, very much like our Rupert Murdoch today, was familiar with the manipulation of language to sell wars, to sell the official story. In 3 guineas, her narrators critique those prostituted fact purveyors, offering prescient advice that clearly resonates with our world today. Looking back to other propaganda models during Woolf's time, in addition to Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann, several important works by Edward Bernays, 1928, Edward Ponsonby, 1928, and Aldous Huxley, 1936, were known to Woolf. I will, in the remainder of my time, note the drastic changes in the varied media that bombards us on a daily basis, the speed with which we can access information, audio, visual, and print, and investigate the power of the media, sometimes in conjunction with the government and corporations that own them, as they continue to manufacture consent. It is important to understand the significant differences between mainstream media and the independent media, and the power of corporate sponsors that own the mainstream media. And on the positive side, I would like to acknowledge our whistleblowers, just naming a few: Ellsberg, Daniel Ellsberg, and Edward Snowden. Many more have been severely punished by the United States government. These whistleblowers work to expose the unethical practices that pervade our governmental departments. And it's never too late, as Daniel Ellsberg proves, to come forward. For he came forward talking about the United States bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki 64 years after it happened. The need for skepticism and critical thinking is crucial at this time, as the propaganda model continues its detrimental influence on our ability to maintain some semblance of democracy. The questions often multiply. Where do we get our information? Are we getting it from the mainstream media, which includes all major newspapers, the Times, the Post, Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, and so on, major TV networks, cable channels, which are almost all corporate owned, as are most newspapers? Or are we getting our news from independent sources, financed by readers and found mostly online? There's a great difference in the news, and sometimes it's like we're talking about different happenings in different countries. This access relates to owning a computer, of course, or having a library that has them. So there are class issues involved in getting our information, and one has to be able to access things other than the mainstream media. And for those people without this access, they don't even get the mainstream media, but probably get most of their news from television, which is the mainstream media, but no print. It is always interesting and important to go to multiple sources on the same day and examine the coverage. It is always surprising to find some significant stories that are not covered, or if they may be on page 16, the go-to page of the New York Times for stories they want to hide. An example of this was the Downing Street memo, the note of July 23rd, 2002 secret meeting of senior British government written by Matthew Rycroft of the M16 and reporting that George W. Bush wanted to remove Saddam Hussein through military action justified by terrorism and WMDs. But, quote, the intelligence and the facts were being fixed around the policy. The case was thin, but I remember that the New York Times, several years after the leaked document, placed the story on page 16 in a single short paragraph, and they never went back to the story. One of the most important stories, as the Iraq War lasted for 20 years. On the same day, my local paper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, placed a lengthy article on this Bush-Blair fabrication on the front page. So there are differences. Another example of the newspaper of record, the New York Times, doing some ethically challenging act had to do with a senior reporter, Judith Miller, and her close relationships with government sources, resulting in her front page articles promoting the Iraq War and her constant reference to WMDs, which were never found. Following her articles, Vice President Dick Cheney would go on the mainstream media Sunday morning talk shows, and he would play up the war and claim that he had gotten his information from the New York Times. Of course, he had put it there by giving it to Judith Miller. Quoting his colleagues, disseminating false information to the world. She was not named in, and she later went to jail, Judith Miller, for outing and endangering the life of a CIA member, Valerie Plame, several years later. On one final story about the New York Times, which involved the Bush government in 2005, they revealed the publication of a report on the Bush administration's, quote, warrantless surveillance of communications of United States citizens, and that it had been delayed for a year. The executive editor of the New York Times, Bill Keller, later revealed that the delay was actually 14 months, and that this new time frame created the potential for influencing the 2004 Bush presidential election results, which is why they requested that the newspaper withhold the story. Many canceled their subscriptions, but as a New York Times reader, I've recently noticed a recent change in some of its coverage on the civilian deaths in Yemen, as the bombing of a school bus in 2018 did not get the coverage it warranted, even after the bombs were shown to be United States bombs that we sold to Saudi Arabia and continue to sell. There were 1,000 more children killed since that school bus bombing in 2018, and the New York Times, just a day or two ago, has now covered everything about the United States involvement in the deaths of all of these children and many more people in Yemen. The thought that this is much too late goes without saying, but it will work its way back, perhaps to something like its former status. But the New York Times is not what it used to be and does not have the reporters that it used to have. And we can attribute this. There's a lot more to say about the economy of newspapers today and how everything must be corporatized and bought, as our politicians are. And so we don't get the information and the work that we need. We have many instances of ethical lapses of journalists, but at this time we also have many journalists jailed in other countries and many being killed to silence them. It takes a courageous journalist like Jeffrey Barg of the Philadelphia Inquirer, my local paper, to state what may not, but many don't have the courage to say, let's put it that way. Barg found that in the United States in the last 80 years, the United States has attacked Guatemala, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Iraq, and Afghanistan, to name a few. But he questions why the avalanche of sentiment that this invasion, Russia invading the Ukraine, is the most consequential since World War II. Barg asks, quote, could it be that it is overwhelmingly white? The language that distinguishes this invasion comes from all over the world, he tells us. And he quotes in his article many of these comments from journalists all over the world. Quote, "They seem like us," wrote Daniel Hannon of the Telegraph. Quote, "War is no longer something visited upon impoverished and remote populations," unquote. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully, city, where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen. That's CBS News. They look like any European family that you'd live next door to. We're not talking about Syrians fleeing the bombing of the Syrian regime backed by Putin, said a French reporter. We're talking about Europeans living in cars that look like ours to save their lives. And last, just to put it bluntly, quote, "These are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from neighboring Ukraine," an NBC reporter, Kelly Cabiella, stated. And she said, quote, "They're Christians. They're white," unquote. None of this is to say we shouldn't care deeply about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and find it absolutely horrifying. This also resonates with a section in the book Manufacturing Consent by Herman and Chomsky, where they talk about worthy victims and unworthy victims. And I don't have time to go into details of that, but the worthy victims would not be the Yemeni people that have been bombed, but they would be the allies in Ukraine. And we can go through this, country by country or color by color. And in the last statement, and I'll end with this statement from Penn's World Voices Festival. And this is stated by Suzanne Nossel, who's the chief executive of PEN America. Quote, "In this moment of chaos and violence, we can address what is the role of the writer as we face down the rise of authoritarianism, disinformation run amok, social fissures that are widening here in this country, and a surge in book banning and threats against free speech." I think that we've all been reading about this, noticing this. I have a little sign on my front window that says I read banned books. And it's what's happening, and I can only speak for the United States, is the problems with information are in an extreme state. And people are not getting the information they should be getting. And that's coming from a person on the left. But I do believe that we should be reading everything and getting the multitude of sides and a nuanced view of what's happening around us. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Judith. Very thought-provoking. Giulia, would you like to go next, please?
Sure. I need to share my screen.
Yeah, I think you just need to press that green button again, Judith, just to stop it.
I'm going to stop share. Okay, got it.
Brilliant. Thank you. Just leave.
Okay. I'm also sharing my paper, if I can find it. Where is it? The link to my paper in the chat.
Okay.
All right, so.
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, can you see the slides?
Yeah, we've got the slide and we've got the paper in the chat.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Okay, so my presentation is titled Same Word, Different Eyes, Photography and Visual Narrative in 3 Guineas. In 3 Guineas, Virginia Woolf exposes the connections between war, power, and gender inequality by means of a visual narrative that draws on photography and vision. Throughout the essay, she translates the female perspective in visual terms and advocates for women's different eyes to impact on the same word with new creative methods. Combining her words with descriptions of photographs unprinted in the book, as well as printed ones, and with evoked images, Woolf's narrative works toward prompting critical thinking and raising dissent while exposing the ethical implications of war and documentary photography still at stake today. After briefly re-examining the critical debate on the use of photography on Guineas, I will focus on the role of visual narrative in Woolf's pacifist and feminist discourse and analyze it in light of Marielle Azulei's political ontology of photography. So the first edition of Guineas contained 5 printed photographs displaying the anonymous portraits of institutional figures of power, then identified by Alice Staveley in 1998 as British representatives, very well known by the readers at the time. The contrast between the ostentation of their, quote, sartorial splendors, unquote, and the narrator's denunciation of the unequal treatment of British women in the domestic and public space has been often remarked for its comic and defamiliarizing effect. More recently, Rebecca Weiser has observed how the identity and political function of the man in the picture is not coincidental. For Weiser, on the contrary, Woolf intentionally omitted their names to bypass censorship and at the same time hinted at their recognizability. The second major set of pictures is mentioned and described repeatedly throughout the text. It's a package of photographs depicting the disasters of the Spanish Civil War. The pictures, however, were never printed in the book, but only described by the narrator and recalled across the text as, quote, photographs of dead bodies and ruined houses, unquote. According to Elena Gualtieri, Woolf might have likely been referring to the photographs of dead children appeared on the Daily Mirror in 1936 in support of the Spanish Republican propaganda. The choice not to publish the photographs has been unanimously interpreted as Woolf's opposition to military intervention and refusal to comply with propaganda. The decision to show and not to show certain photographs reveals Woolf's awareness of the potential and of the ambivalence of the photographic medium. As Jane Marcus observed, the book meant to, quote, overthrow patriarchal forms, unquote, and did not meet the reader's expectations. Woolf's aim was precisely not to please, but on the contrary, to disturb and point the connection between war and the systemic oppression of women across Europe, as well as in her country. Jean Mills defined Guineas a treatise on photographic theory able to revolutionize the act of seeing, unquote. Perception is indeed crucial for Woolf's arguments. Throughout the text, the narrator compares the way of life of educated men and women by means of metaphors pertaining to sight, point of view, and contrast between light and shadow. Interestingly, the third most recurring visual element in the text is women's gaze. They look outside the curtained windows of their houses, and once they gain access to the world of professions, they are pictured as they leave the house and walk on a bridge connecting the private with the public world. This in-between distance position enables them to look at the public world where a procession of men is taking place. This view is described as a, quote, crudely colored photograph, a bird's eye view, unquote. In the same passage, Woolf emphasizes how unbridgeable is the gap between the domestic and professional world. Though we see the same world, we see it through different eyes. In Civil Imagination, a political ontology of photography, Marielle Azoulay envisages photography as a space enabling encounters and negotiation that take place within and beyond the photographed event and the single photograph. Situated in the field of visual culture studies, her work sets out to imagine a civil discourse under conditions of regime-made disaster, unquote, referring in her case to the control of Palestine by the State of Israel. Under such conditions, she argues, quote, citizenship is restricted to a series of privileges that only a portion of the governed population enjoys, and even then, to an unequal degree. The central right pertaining to the privileged segment of the population consists in the right to view disaster, to be its spectator, end quote. In the Palestinian context, those who are not considered citizens are the same who appear in photographs of disasters and fall under the category of refugees. On the other hand, Israelis' rights as citizens also involve the privilege to witness disaster from a distance. Azulai's essay, quote, seeks to imagine a civil discourse, unquote, in order to suspend the point of view of governmental power and the nationalist characteristics that enable it to divide the governed from one another and to set its factions against one another, end quote. The political ontology of photography aims to envisage photography as a means to relate to the visible and to practice a civil gaze in order to escape the visual conventions established by the regime. The event of photography, quote, is made up of an infinite series of encounters, end quote, between multiple participants. The camera, the person behind the lens, whoever is facing the lens, the spectator of the product of this encounter. The relationship between the participants is equal and no longer based on the authority of the photographer and of the image as the final outcome of the act of photography. All participants, including subjects and spectators, have the same agency in the space of the encounter. As far as the political is concerned, Azulay borrows from Hannah Arendt its definition as, quote, the space where people exist together in public, end quote. I'll quote again, I use the term political to describe a space of relations between people who are exposed to one another in public, and I analyze photography rather than the individual photograph as one of the manifestations of this space, end quote. In this context, the gaze takes on a crucial function in reformulating the relation to the visible and invisible. The role of the spectator and of her gaze is essential to, quote, generate new utterances, end quote, and possibilities for the photograph to circulate and be read within and outside its original context. I'm quoting again, without regard for the practical and civil intentions that render the photograph an utterance or a series of utterances, the photograph will remain merely one form of testimony to the suffering of others, or, if you like, one form of testimony to the fate of those destined for suffering, as opposed to the fate of those destined to observe them. In regarding the pain of others, Susan Santac criticizes the use of photographs of the Spanish Civil War in Three Guineas, arguing against Woolf's supposed belief that the unanimous indignation aroused by the sight of the atrocities of war can be the answer to the question how to prevent war. As Naomi Toth has recently pointed out, Santac fails to read between the lines of Woolf's irony and interprets her mention to war photographs as naive, idealistic, and dismissing a proper political contextualization. I'm reading this quote by Santac. Invoking this hypothetical shared experience, Woolf professes to believe that the shock of such pictures cannot fail to unite people of goodwill. Does it? It is this we that Woolf challenges at the start of her book. She refuses to allow her interlocutor to take a we for granted. But into this we, after the pages devoted to the feminist point, she then subsides. No we should be taken for granted when the subject is looking at other people's pain. End quote. Woolf's feminist point, however, draws precisely on the comparison between the reference of that we the educated man's sons and daughters with unequal access to education and professions turns out to be the discriminating factor in terms of having a real impact on society and therefore on the prevention of war. Santac reads Woolf's allusion to the reliability and objectivity of the photographic medium as in a literal sense, as statements of facts, disregarding the very different turn taken by the argument throughout the essay. The supposed objectivity of photography seems to justify the hypothesis that there must be a, quote, shared perspective on reality, unquote, and that a homogeneous emotional reaction to the brutality of war might be a starting point towards the mobilization of educated men and women against it. Woolf simultaneously resorts to and puts into question the unmediated nature of the photographs, remediating them through language and presenting them as universal depictions of war. This strategy reveals Woolf's awareness of the ambiguity of the photographic medium, but also of its power. And far from dismissing political engagement, not only does the narrator allude to the propagandistic exploitation of war photographs, but she also draws attention to the pacifists' responsibility in recognizing and opposing the exclusion of women from the British public life. The act of looking at photographs on the table accompanies the Woolfian spectator throughout the text, and its reiteration deprives the pictures of their supposed power to create consent. Simultaneously, the letters expose the economic, social, and political disparity between the sexes. The act of looking expands the event of photography and reveals the power relations between its participants. To read Three Guineas with Azulay in the unmediated images of Spanish war, quote, the photographed person, designated the victim, is presented as the object of therapeutic or humanitarian intervention, end quote. Victims of war are visible as objects, the refugees, women and children, but remain invisible as they have no agency and can't benefit of the same rights as their oppressors and other privileged citizens. In a similar way, the educated man's daughter's invisibility in the public space has to do with their restricted access to civil rights. Seeing them also has to do with seeking the visibility of women in a world built for man and by man on the basis of structural violence and oppression. Azulay's theory seeks to liberate photography from disciplinary rules and from the claims regarding its truth and objectivity. In fact, she says, quote, truth is not to be found in the photograph, end quote. Crucially, the use of photographs in Three Guineas involves a process of reformulation that eventually disrupts their referential nature and objectivity and reverses their original purpose so that they acquire a completely different meaning. The printed plates of British patriarchs do not fulfill a celebrative function, but thanks to the interplay with the narrator's words and the knowledge of readers of the time, the photographs acquire a derisive and accusatory function. The third plate, depicting the head of the British justice system walking out of a building, followed by its officials, is preceded by a series of questions. Quote, let us never cease from thinking, what is this civilization in which we find ourselves? What are these ceremonies and why should we take part in them? What are these professions and why should we make money out of them? Where is, in short, is it leading us, the procession of the sons of educated men? Although there is no mention to the referentiality of the photograph in the text, the utterance questioning the opportunity of joining the procession of men clearly hints at the scene below. The frame is crowded with men in uniform, symbolizing the weights of traditional institutions unwilling to promote true inclusion. They seem to leave no space for women to join the professional world. But are women willing to join them? Speaking of a, quote, pattern of repeated imagery, end quotes, Emily Dalgarno remarked how the image of the bridge was originally more recurrent in the early drafts of Guineas. But in the first edition, it was to a large extent replaced by the description of a colored photograph prompting the gaze of educated men's daughters and their critical thinking. The moment of transition towards the public space allows them to closely examine the landscape and the procession of men moving freely across the place. As outsiders, women look at the world from outside of it, and thanks to this position, this vantage point, they're able to question the value and the authenticity of what they see in the picture in front of them. Woolf recognizes that gaze can be passive and distant, a sight merely a photograph, yet seeing is crucial for the apprehension of the world. We need look passively no longer. Seeing differently and practicing Azulei's civil gaze allows women to discern whether to join the procession of men or not. And she says, think we must, says the narrator. Seeing, thinking, and asking questions is what the Woolfian female spectator needs in order to devise her own methods to prevent war. Towards the end of the third letter, the narrator introduces one last image imposing itself, a colored photograph depicting the figure of the Nazi fascist dictator, standing out against the background of ruined houses and dead bodies. Its description retraces the movements of the gaze as it wanders across the image like a film camera, conjuring up the monumentality and impressiveness of the dictator. The narrator's purpose, however, is not to, quote, excite once more the sterile emotion of hate, but other and more complex emotions, end quote. Looking at a crudely colored photograph, she perceives its relations with the previous pictures, and I quote. It suggests that the public and the private worlds are inseparably connected, that the tyrannies and servilities of the one are the tyrannies and servilities of the other. It suggests that we cannot dissociate ourselves from that figure, but are ourselves that figure. It suggests that we are not passive spectators doomed to unresisting obedience, but by our thoughts and actions can ourselves change that figure. Acknowledging the impossibility of dissociating themselves from the epitome of patriarchal power blurs the line between oppressors and oppressed. By looking at this photograph, the narrator takes her own responsibility and urges the reader, spectator, to do the same. Breaking away from pictures of evil, either fascism or the atrocities of war, is easier than recognizing one's complicity with the system of oppression in the first place. In Guineas, looking at photographs becomes a practice of active spectatorship and citizenship. At the same time, the use of photographs can be seen as a new method to unveil the patriarchal dynamics still rooted in Woolf and our society. By considering the event of photography as the result of multiple relations, not circumscribed to the photograph as finite product, Azulei's civil use of photography aims to reformulate the human rights discourse by shifting the focus from the victims to the regimes of power generating them. In a similar way, Woolf turns photographs into spaces of negotiation between unbalanced gendered perspectives by reversing their traditional function. As the images imprinted in the book accumulate on the narrator's table, the reader is guided in the visualization of the bigger picture of patriarchal society. Hence, the visual narrative in Guineas sets an example on the ethical function of photography beyond the traditional display of human rights violation in order to raise awareness on the underlying causes of structural violence in our society. And that's all. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Giulia. So if we have like a 5-minute break and then come back in 5 minutes and we'll do the questions. That's okay. We'll keep the collar open there. Okay, if everybody can come back. Let's give it another few seconds. Okay. See if everybody's back. Okay, this might be a good opportunity if everybody would be so kind as to turn their cameras on, and if we just pause and smile and take a screenshot that we can put on Twitter. Alexandra and Emma, can you do that, please? See if they do it. Okay, they don't want to do it. Smile. Oh, they're doing it, yay. Alexandra. Okay, we're just going to do it. Brilliant, thank you. So for the questions and comments, just put the comments in the chat, put your hand up, or just jump in. Any questions? Jane Goldman, please.
Hello, thank you both very much. What wonderful, heartening papers to hear in such wicked times. I wonder if you might both like to reflect on 3 Guineas in terms of what Elsa Hogberg delineated in her keynote about the possibility. I mean, she branded 3 Guineas as predominantly paranoid as opposed to reparative. And certainly I thought, you know, Judith's paper kind of wonderfully supported the paranoid nature of much of the work of critics like Chomsky and Herman, who are unmasking euphemisms for what they are. So you would have to call that a kind of paranoid criticism, a necessary one. It's not derogatory to be paranoid. It's a necessary political and ethical move. But you, Giulia, what you seem to be doing was opening up the photograph as this site which might turn into the reparative, rather, although it's about exposing who's politically in charge of and responsible, that maybe something other than unmasking is going on in the ability of a photograph in relation to text, or the withholding of text makes it a site of civic negotiation or public negotiation, which might be considered reparative. I don't know. Anyway, I'd just like to ask you both what you think of how useful that Sedgwick model is for thinking about 3 Guineas. And I just want, I mean, it's, yeah, that's my question.
Okay, I have to think about that for a minute. I do agree with what you said about the paranoia of the whistleblowers out there, the people that are exposing things and questioning everything. And it's just such a crazy time that the New York Times had an article about media education and how they're going into elementary schools to get them to read differently. To me, it seems like the old critical thinking that they're finally bringing back, that is so necessary. But to go back to your point about 3 Guineas, I want to make sure that I understand your, are you saying that 3 Guineas it falls into the category, which I think you were saying that Elsa was saying, of this paranoid with or
I'm saying,
yeah, which
yeah,
I would go along with.
You know, I mean, I think what most readings do is to understand it as a necessary paranoid critique of unmasking. But you know, it's the question that Sedgwick raises of, well, that gets you so far,
Right?
And you know, I mean, that gets you so far. So is there another reparative resource that is there that somehow does something to, I mean, appease and ameliorate seem to me synonyms that you could apply to the notion of the reparative, that it can be seen as something that's trying to make safe the object of harm that is the paranoid always identifies. So, but in its more positive understanding of the reparative, that it somehow is an enabling process that equips us to do more than sit in horror at what the paranoid critique has exposed. And unfortunately, I think there's, Cedric is pointing out that there is a fatigue and a kind of, that actually we're all aware, that paranoid is a kind of strange position to be in, where we pretend that something needs to be unveiled when it's quite obviously, fascism is showing the fist. It's not that we're having any difficulty identifying it, and the idea that we don't understand what a euphemism is, and we need somebody to really point out to us that collateral damage means dead civilians. So I'm with Elsa in saying, the foreground position of Three Guineas surely is paranoid. It's 1938, but it's kind of like, it's not paranoid in the kind of easy way of exposing these are the dead bodies, these are the consequences. It's trying to expose the power structure, which is still a kind of paranoid position. So I suppose I wanted to ask you what do you think about the reparative as well? The paranoid can just be like, well, and yes, we now understand that, but how do we go forward?
I've been thinking a lot about, I guess, both sides of what Elsa was, revealing or exploring regarding information with what is happening in our country and all over the world, as far as how do we decide what to believe? How do we trust the person that's controlling this? We know that the governments can't be trusted. We know the governments lie to us all the time. And yet, which is what you're saying, that we all know about, collateral damage and all of these euphemisms that are being used. And yet, when I talk to people and expose something, for instance, when in the 2016 election, when everybody was voting for, quote, the woman Hillary, I was just curious to see if they knew her voting record as a senator, and that she voted against cluster bombs, banning cluster bombs. And she had to, because all of her campaigns have been supported by Raytheon and all the other weapons industry. And what I got was that people were very upset with me for asking that question, for bringing that up, for exposing that. People are comfortable with these facades and not knowing. And it's difficult to investigate and really face things. And I think that the world today we're so bombarded with so much killing and lying and everything, that it's difficult to do what Elsa talked about in her. I think both sides are difficult. I think that we have to go along with being paranoid, and we have to keep questioning. But in my talking to people, and I find that I'm in a very limited group of people that really want to investigate and kind of face up to the horrors that we're dealing with today. And I've lived a long time, so I've seen a lot, and I see things not getting better. I'm looking for the reparative. I'm looking for what can we do to make people question the information they're getting, which sometimes I find laughable, but it's, and I don't watch the mainstream media, and I read the New York Times. As Chomsky said once, he reads the New York Times to critique it. It used to be a very good paper, but hasn't been for a long time. But I still read it every day, and but I get my news online from other sources where I trust the people, and they're not being paid and they're not bought. So it's difficult. People don't want to take the time, don't have the time, don't have the technology to look at everything. I think it's a very difficult question, but I think that, and I do think you have to try to look at both sides. The reparative is really a more difficult side for me, because I don't, I'm not seeing the means or anything out there that, so when I read this article about how, Finland is taking these elementary school students and making them media savvy and questioning everything, I thought back to, well, this is the old critical thinking that has disappeared from our lives. But, it's obviously they're trying to take steps to change at a lower level, anyway, the elementary school level. And it's so hard to talk about all of this in this, thinking about what we've just experienced in the last few weeks in all of our countries. But the United States the gun violence is, out of control.
Thank you. Giulia, what do you think?
Thank you, Jane, for your question. Well, I agree with Judith. There is, and with you, there is certainly a paranoid, like a huge paranoid aspect in Three Guineas, but maybe a reparative way of reading it is that, well, from my point of view, you said, okay, photographs can help us unmasking, okay, what is concealed, what is hidden from the government. And after that, Wolf invites us, to think about other ways, okay, to prevent war or what, like everything else, which is, associable with war. So I think maybe this can be seen as reparative, even if she doesn't give us, a practical way of doing it. And that's, the connection with what Judith was saying, because there are actually then very few people who want to do the work, and investigate and trying to change things. But maybe thinking of Azulei, I think her idea that photographs are not something that is provided, from above, top down, in a top down process. So they are something that you can really manipulate, and you can, change and move and see them from other perspectives, and also involving like the people actually represented in the photographs. That could be maybe a method to, see things in another way and thinking in another way. And there's at the end of her book, she talks about, there's kind of an anecdote when she tells about soldiers, like Israeli soldiers that had invaded a Palestinian town, and they knew there was a football match, I think something like that, and they wanted to watch the match. So they burst into a house and, you know, took control of the house and watched the match on television. And there is a picture of this, really, of this scene. And then they were interviewed and they watched, like they saw the picture, like after a few time, and they recognized that's what they were actually doing was, you know, awful. And so also this idea that through photography you can see and see again, you know, from another perspective. So they were able to change their mind. I don't know to what extent, but at least they recognized, you know, they were actually looting. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very helpful.
Yep, and Jeanette.
Can I just maybe follow up? And I just want to make sure that I'm following Elsa's distinction through Sedgwick, through Jane's question. So correct me, whoever. I wonder if Susan Sontag's, the reference that you made, Giulia, to Sontag's critique of Woolf, right, is a way of calling out, quote, the paranoia of Three Guineas, and that she's making an assumption that Woolf is trying to move out of that mode into something, I don't know necessarily reparative is the word, but that she's critiquing that gesture of Woolf's and saying that Woolf doesn't pull it off. Would that be an accurate way of trying to articulate this perspective, do you think? Am I getting that right?
Okay, I think, thank you for the question. I think Sontag, I mean, I don't know if she read the full, you know, work by Woolf, the full Three Guineas, but I think, in my opinion, she stopped, you know, at the surface. So she was, which is, I think, the first time you read Three Guineas, okay, and you arrive to that passage, okay, you think, yes, she's saying that she believes photographs can, you know, manufacture consent, can unify our reaction and can prompt, you know, a concrete reaction to the disasters. And Sontag questions this idea. Okay, she says, of course, this is not true. Okay, of course, this never happens, like in reality, and we know it never happens. You know, I remember the photograph of a child, you know, drowned on a seashore in Greece. I think you all saw that. Okay, Alan Kurdi, and that I was reading a paper about that, about, you know, the politics. Reactions after the appearance of that photographs, and there was, you know, at the beginning everyone was promising to change policies and, you know, help refugees, but then nothing happened, and we know it's still a huge problem. But to come back to Sontag, I think the only problem is that she doesn't see what Woolf is doing, because she doesn't grasp that double, you know, usage of the photograph as an unmediated or mediated medium. Okay, so but Sontag actually agrees with Woolf and also with Azoulay that you can't, I mean, indignation is not the solution. Okay, you need to go beyond that. So after you react, which is human, and of course we all do that, you also feel helpless. Like, of course, she's saying these things in the 20th century, at the end, at the beginning of the 21st century. So in a very different context, we are overwhelmed by images. So we don't know anymore, what to do, because everywhere there's disasters and death and everything. And I every year go and see the World Press photo exhibition. It's it's tragic, because you don't know what to do after that, but what can you do? I mean, you can step back, Santac says, and think, but she also says, let the atrocious images haunt us. So it's not a problem of not showing, death, but the problem is finding a way to think through that images, through narrative.
Do you think that what we need is to think of the accretive in the reparative? That there's a paranoid reading that applies to both the withheld images. Woolf could have used the images of the dead children or whatever, and that's a very paranoid gesture. And so too is the gesture of exposing who's in power. Although, I think what you're saying is that the withholding of the labeling, for whatever political strategic reasons, brings the reader into a kind of interaction which is complicating. And Sedgwick talks about the reparative as being, it's not making something whole, but it's kind of accretive, it's supplementing. And in that sense, although the photographs of the dead children are not there, they very much are there in the bigger civic public space that other newspapers are publishing them, and that that an act of accretion is always the adding onto, the complicating, the thickening of what begins as a kind of paranoid exposure. It's not that it won't do you harm. This is a harmful object. This is harm coming towards us. But it's what do you do that's constructive? And I think that the collage technique, the juxtaposition of always insisting on another image, or not the image you expect, of disrupting the images that you're receiving, will result in this accretion, this baroque, a kind of, I mean, Sedgwick is linking it to a kind of queer aesthetics. And I wonder if that, in the end is a kind of gesture of peacemaking, that you're busy, doing something to deter lethal violence, which is, at the moment, what I find most upsetting, apart from the hypocrisy over the Ukrainian refugees, the way we've suddenly forgotten about all the other victims of Western interventions, is that nobody seems to be talking about peace negotiations. It's not on the agenda in, investigative journalism, that there's no kind of attempt to change the discourse, or to put something up against all this accepting the war. First of all, it isn't the war. And secondly, it needn't be a war if we start thinking about peace and ways of negotiating this to stop. So I would call that, that's where the reparative comes in. And then, of course, the problem with paranoid is that we, you know, coming out of America, you've got these paranoid nut jobs, you know, the MAGA people who believe QAnon and all this stuff. You know, that's like the kind of psychotic end of paranoia, where it's not, it's tipped over from the being on the edges, the boundaries of knowledge, to actually total fiction making. I think that's an interesting thing that happens with propaganda too, that you know, there's always some element of the knowable in efficient propaganda. But you know, the QAnon stuff is like, you know, it's just detached from reality. Anyway, that's
Judith.
To take it back to, I guess I've been thinking about this a lot, the lack of negotiation, because the news that I watch and the people that I watch, the alternative press, let's say, there was, you know, an attempt at negotiation. There were things that were negotiable at the very beginning. No one had to be killed, and it was negated and, you know, passed on. And of course, the mainstream press never talked about negotiations, but the people that I was listening to and the historians that I listened to learn more about the region, I spent a lot of time doing that at first, not knowing enough, but everybody was talking about, you know, you can negotiate this, let's have some diplomacy here. And yet you turn to the mainstream press and the information you were getting was, you know, let's send them more weapons. Let's extend this war. Let's humiliate Putin, whatever. And no one's happy about what's happening there. And we all wanted it to end right away. But you know, sitting there for, what is it, 3 months now, and having listened to possible potential negotiations, things that could have worked by experts in Russian history that know much more than I do, and what my government is doing. I didn't vote for him. Is terrible, and it's just extending the war, attempting to look at a weaker Russia, whatever their goal is, which is ridiculous. So I agree with everything you said, Jane, that there was a chance for reparative actions that could have worked, but they couldn't have worked, not with the policies that are in place in the United States government. And the United States is leading all the other countries. They just follow the United States and you know, sending more weaponry and continuing to
and making money out of it. I mean,
money. Oh, this is the whole thing. The weapons industry is making a fortune out of this, and NATO is part of that. And now we have Finland and Sweden trying to, you know, joining NATO. What Putin was asking for at the start was, and you know, to say to someone he was being reasonable, that if this was happening on our coast, we would kind of want the same thing. You don't want more NATO nations surrounding you. NATO being, you know, the United States. So that was understandable. And they're, you know, with a nuclear power, you kind of, you know, we have to deal with our enemies. We don't like what they do. We don't like him, but there are ways to, you know, as you were saying, you know, there are steps that can be taken that are reasonable, but we're not getting that. And the information that most people are getting, unfortunately, is not the news that I'm getting or the people that I'm watching who are, you know, experts in the Ukraine and trying to learn the history of it and what happened there. And so, and this goes back a long time, and there are many more people that have been killed in the Ukraine. And to go back to what I was saying before about what Chomsky talks about of worthy victims and unworthy victims, yeah. That became a really interesting thought process when you think about, well, Palestinians, they're not worthy victims.
No.
But you know, with the Syrians are not worthy victims. The Yemenis are not there, and these are, all brown and black people. And that's a part of it, but not the whole thing. And
Christian.
yeah, exactly. So it's so difficult to stay focused and think about this and think about why can't we do the, kind of the sensible thing? What, we didn't have to see all these dead people and all these buildings destroyed. And yet, as Jane said, a lot of money to be made in all of this, especially the weapons. And I mean, the United States just spent $54 billion to Ukraine for weapons. Our people are homeless, starving, no medicine, and we're buying weapons. So it does, it seems kind of crazy to face all of this, but this is what's happening. And it's interesting. I always thought of Three Guineas as a book about education, and there's so much in there about women's education, all kinds of education, and yet it's really they focus on language. The repetition of words throughout the book is so compelling to really make us think about, and Woolf does this all the time, to make us think about the language and how it is being interpreted. And her arguments in Three Guineas are so masterful, I think, in the way she gets to the important points, I should say, her narrator does. And it's an exercise in frustration. I think what I said at the beginning of my paper about, grabbing your phone every morning or to find out what you're looking at the paper and say, well, what's happened today? What harm am I going to be confronted with at this time? And it just seems, I don't know if we're just getting more sent to us in record time, or if things were better before, but I don't think so. And I've been around for a really long time. So it's a very difficult question that Elsa was addressing, and I think she did a wonderful job of it. But I think we have to stay a little bit paranoid. Healthy paranoia is what is needed. It's I thought when I read that article in my local paper by the guy that talked about why all this fuss about the Ukraine, and all the quotes that he used from all over the world, I thought that was really remarkable and courageous, and we need more of that. But it's I was out with friends, and we're talking about Ukraine, and I used the word proxy war, and they went crazy. That it's not that. And so, yeah, I mean, it's gotten really difficult to even have conversations with people that, and the way I look at it, people that are not getting the same information I'm getting. So I can put it. So, Judith,
will you be able to share your paper? Can you share it with us?
Yes. I just have to do a little touching up but I can definitely do that. Yes, absolutely.
I'm going to just email it to people.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Giulia, for making yours available. It's really helpful.
Yes.
I think it helps you listen better, knowing that you've got the copy of the paper as well. So you can kind of listen and think on your feet more. Being able to even just flick to it while
Yes,
you
I
talk.
really think it's helpful to see the words. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tanya, did you want to come in with your comment?
Well, I think that everyone who's spoken has really complicated my idea beautifully. But I have a thought as I'm listening to you all. And up until recently, I've worked with young people, teens, and their information about the world these days is mediated through Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok.
Oh, gosh.
And it's really interesting working with them and speaking with them and helping them be critical thinkers of about what they're receiving. And they both are bombarded with the crazy stuff, the QAnon, and as well as really solid information. And I think that at least the young people that I've been working with are they're very savvy, which gives me a lot of hope for our younger generations. And the kids who really see things for what they are and are more critical thinkers help teach the kids who are not really seeing things as well. They listen to each other. And I found that a really, really productive and interesting moment in my pedagogy.
Sounds very good and hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
Any last thoughts or comments?
So I'd like to thank everyone for coming. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just, I'm
Thank you,
thinking. I can't speak anymore because there's so much. But thank you because it was great. Also, I'm also a little sad about all we have been saying, but
Yeah.
maybe there's hope. Children.
The comment in your talk, Giulia, that, wolves, that we are ourselves that dictator, and the whole way that links up to something more reparative, right? That transition, that's the difficulty that Judith's paper keeps articulating, that we don't want to see ourselves as part of the problem, right? We want to be able to separate things into these compartmentalized spaces, right? And I think what your talk and Azule's work, I'm so fascinated by it. I'm going to get that book, right? All of this is about, right, changing that dynamic, and that if there's optimism in this conversation, I guess it's that, right? That there are enough people across the generations and in different spaces that are recognizing that and trying to make that happen. And that's the optimism I will take away from this session. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's a nice note to end it on. Thank you, Jeanette. Yep, so thank you, Judith and Giulia, for your fantastic papers. Thank you, Reilly, for doing the tech. And I'll see you all in the later panels.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good to see